Benghazi. Sarah Adams, this CIA targeter that they bring on, talks about it as if it's just a scandal about U.S. security personnel being abandoned, kind of like the POW MIAs were abandoned in Vietnam. It's not about the bank shot where Gaddafi's arms were being sent to the Syrian so-called rebels by the CIA, and Chris Stevens was sent to Benghazi to do that and got caught in these highly unusual riots. No discussion of that. No discussion of how ISIS, the Islamic State in suits, came to power in Syria. I mean, it's shocking. The biggest scandal, I think, one of the biggest scandals we're witnessing is how the US, the entire West, and the NATO, along with Qatar and Turkey, which is in NATO, are welcoming this new government in Syria, which is the product of this whole dirty war. And you don't see anyone in the national security world freaking out about it at all. They're like, it didn't happen. And they're bringing Al-Qaeda members from Tajikistan, from Albania, and from Jordan into top-level defense ministry positions in Syria, along with Uyghurs.
And they're implementing Sharia law, which is something the right freak out about.
Yeah.
Oh, Sharia. They're actually done it in Syria just in the last 2 weeks. And it's not up for discussion on all these high-level, counterterrorism podcasts, which is kind of a joke.
Yeah, where are the Islamophobes? I rarely say, like, where are the Islamophobes? Oh, calling all Islamophobes. But I mean, it's like they have so much fodder right now if they wanted to, like, make a big deal about this. But it's because they're just a bunch of stooges for Israel. Look at the new justice minister in Syria. Confirmed, Syria's current interim minister of justice, Shadi al-Wais, appears in 2 videos from 2015 in which he oversees the public executions of 2 women accused of prostitution. This is like the Idlib Vice Squad. I can't play this because it's too graphic and we're probably already demonetized, but it's too graphic. But basically, the current minister of justice, who was elected by no one in Syria, came into power through a violent putsch. They sentence a woman to death, and then they just shoot her in the head with a pistol for alleged prostitution. These are de facto Turkish prostitutes for the Turkish MIT who are doing this. But this didn't even raise any alarm. It's not even being reported in US media. And Tommy Robinson, I mean, what's he talking about? Groomer gangs. So it's really shocking. Aaron, I don't know if you want to, if you get the same sense as we do, that the scandal of the Syrian dirty war's triumph is being kind of swept under the rug.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, this was predicted, and this has been par for the course, to minimize or whitewash the sectarian nature of the insurgency that was supported from the start. And so it's just shocking to me that there's not more tact on the part of Jelani and his people, like to appoint a justice minister who's on video taking part in an execution of a woman for, as you said, adultery. They don't think through, what that might look like, but maybe they don't care. Maybe they realize that, their mission's been accomplished. They overthrew Assad, and they know that they'll have the backing of the US and other foreign powers in what they do. So I suppose that doesn't matter to them. I mean, like, the sad thing is seeing people who bought into so much dirty war propaganda now acting surprised that this is what they cheered for. This is what they helped to usher in. And then the other people who've been appointed to positions, a lot of them aren't even Syrian. They come from foreign insurgencies that played a major role in the overthrow. There we go.
A Tajik foreign man has become a commander in the Syrian army. Yeah. This is a real victory for the Syrian people. By the way, this is Radio Free Europe's Tajik language publication. Saifuddin Tajibayev has been appointed to a high position in the Syrian Ministry of Defense. And he's wanted in Tajikistan on suspicion of participation in foreign wars and involvement in terrorist acts. and he's from Jamaat Tawhid wa Jihad, which is sanctioned by the United States State Department and Treasury OFAC. Do you hear anything about this in US media? It's like barely circulating on Twitter. Other top defense officials, again, include a Uyghur from Xinjiang from the Turkestan Islamic Party. And why would the US actually oppose that when they're setting up basically a base in Syria for future attacks on China and Russia? I mean, look at here's Syrian, these Uyghurs in Syria. Hey, you bloody Chinese government. So you decided to oppress East Turkestan? The East Turkestan Mujahideen are firing these weapons. These are Grad missiles that they just captured from the Syrian military. They're not going to attack Israel. They're not going to defend Palestinians. So a new base has been established to attack China. I don't know what China's doing about this.
And this is why Mike Pompeo personally took them off the terror list, so they could be used for things like threatening China. I mean, why else would Mike Pompeo have done this? Did the East Turkestan movement suddenly reform itself and renounce terrorism? No, but Mike Pompeo saw them as being useful for the goal of weakening China, just as if they were useful for the goal of, bleeding Hezbollah and Iran and Russia inside Syria, which was, a major point of the whole dirty war to begin with.
So, yeah, I mean, you have freak out, Elon Musk, AstroTurf freak out about rape gangs in the UK. Meanwhile, on the shores of Syria in the Mediterranean, a boat captured by from the Wagner group by Tawhid wa Jihad from Tajikistan, which has just been granted a top level position in the Syrian Defense Ministry. They're just like, I'm on a boat. I'm on a boat. They're just like having the time of their lives in the Mediterranean. This is not the Syrian people. These are not Syrians. These are guys from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And Aaron and Patrick, the U.S. just ended sanctions on Syria as these figures came into power.
They've put a waiver on the sanctions for 6 months. On some of them, by the way, not all of them. But what does that reflect? It reflects the awareness that these sanctions hurt ordinary civilians. That's who they were targeted at, contrary to propaganda. The aim of the sanctions was to basically make the people suffer enough, make the state collapse enough so that regime change can be achieved. And now that regime change has been achieved, they've lost their excuse to keep maintaining these sanctions and their excuse to keep pretending that these sanctions don't hurt the Syrian people. So the fact that these sanctions were waived is a recognition that they knew all along that these sanctions hurt the Syrian people, but it's only for 6 months. And the reason for that is they want to make sure that the new government falls in line and basically, stays within the bounds that the U.S. sets for them. And it's interesting, the new government of Syria, the new ministry, they just put out a statement basically saying that the sanctions hurt the Syrian people. I'll read it. We would like to highlight that the economic sanctions are still targeting the Syrian people, despite the fact that the reason for which they were imposed has been removed. So that's the new government acknowledging what we've been saying all along, which is that the sanctions target the Syrian people. And there's been this huge effort to pretend from dirty war apologists, no, they're only against the government of Syria. They only target Assad and his inner circle. It was always such a lie. And now the same people who were making that argument while they were eviscerating ordinary Syrians are now begging the U.S. to abandon these sanctions. People like Josh Rogan of the Washington Post, these groups, these lobbyists in the U.S. that were instrumental in the passage of these sanctions. Now they're all pleading for these sanctions to be waived. And Biden has just done that partially, for 6 months, which he also did back after the earthquake of February 2023. That was another admission that these sanctions hurt ordinary people. But even back then, Biden's waiver was only temporary. And that it's the same thing now.
Patrick, I thought these sanctions only hurt the Assad regime.
Far from it. Quite the opposite, in fact. And even people in the Syrian government would have told you, which they told Boutena Shaban told me, as Assad's advisor, that unfortunately the sanctions don't hurt us because we still need to go to work every day. We still need our security detail. We still need our driver because this country needs to function, is what she told us. And so she's up, whether they think or not, it will never hurt the government because the state needs to exist. The army needs to defend the borders and the roads, and the government needs to go to work every day. It hurts ordinary people, and it's collective punishment. And to me, it's the Caesar sanctions. That's based on a fraud.
Yep.
That's based on a fraud, and that will come out now. You'll start to see after, when it becomes safe, people who have already picked that apart. Mainstream media and enterprising award-winning journalists will get a hold of everybody else's work on it. Rick Sterling was a guy who did a great debunking of this. He's kind of an independent journalist from Berkeley, California. He even did very easily and swiftly debunked it, and other people have picked it apart. And that's going to be fair game now because it's done its job. Yeah.
And the supposed identity of Caesar was supposed to come out, and it's being reported that he's Caesar, his name is Osama Otman or Sami Otman. But then when you watch interviews with him, he actually says he's the double of Caesar, and that he was the person who was just handling Caesar. So we don't actually know who Caesar is. We haven't met him. There's nothing stopping him from revealing his identity. But the sanctions were pushed by the Syrian opposition in Washington, and they were authorized without the expectation that there would be regime change this December. And so they were, reenacted, and they have to give this waiver so the new Al-Qaeda Brooks Brothers regime can have an economy. Turkey and Qatar are bringing in energy stations to increase the energy output of Syria. All the walls around Syria that prevented it from functioning once Caesar went into effect in 2020, that would put Alina Duhan, the UN special rapporteur on sanctions, told you 80% of the population had been put below the poverty line by these sanctions and into food insecurity. That's all over, but there's no human rights or democracy. I mean, I think this is as discrediting to the rules-based order as the Gaza genocide has been, that they say democracy, human rights again and again and again. And then one of the most vicious, malign forces on the planet comes into power in Damascus. And then they just lift sanctions because they promise not to attack Israel and occupation US troops. I mean,
and it's so cynical. It's just so cynical. This idea that one state far away has the right to basically impose a siege on a war-torn country that's already been decimated by a dirty war. And then some bureaucrats in Washington sign some forms and basically sentence, millions of Syrians to misery, raise their food prices. And they brag about it. I mean, I've quoted this a million times. Top Trump officials bragged about the fact that their sanctions exacerbated food and fuel shortages for everyday Syrians. And amazingly, some of them had the gall to pretend as if this was not what was happening. So while you had people like Andrew Tabler and James Jeffrey, who were top Trump officials for Syria, claiming that, bragging about the fact that these sanctions hurt ordinary Syrians, you people like Joel Rayburn, and let's watch this clip. If you click on it, let's watch this clip of Joel Rayburn claiming that all this is just Syrian government propaganda.
We believe that we should reevaluate our sanctions policies towards Syria. We'll just limit it to Syria right now. In light of the unintended effects that the sanctions appear to be having on everyday Syrians' food supply in areas controlled by the Assad regime. And I guess a follow-up to that is, what specific steps is the administration taking to help alleviate the hunger crisis in Syria?
Thank you, Ms. Wild. So over the last, since the beginning of fiscal year 2020, the United States has actually spent $1.7 billion on humanitarian assistance to Syrian people. So we've stepped up our contribution. At the same time, we made very clear through our diplomatic engagements, our engagement with civil society and business communities, that there are specific carve-outs to our sanctions programs so that we do not constrain humanitarian assistance on the ground, nor things like food production. The Assad regime has undertaken, along with its allies, a propaganda campaign to claim that we do, but we've clarified at every opportunity that we don't sanction that kind of activity. The kind of people and businesses and organizations that we're sanctioning under our sanctions program right now are the worst of the entourage of Bashar al-Assad and his regime, and they're not doing anything. To the kind of people we're sanctioning, kind of organizations we're sanctioning, are not doing anything to alleviate suffering of the Syrian people. They're the ones causing the suffering of the Syrian people. So, in particular, under the Caesar Act, the point of the Caesar Act is to put pressure on the regime so that they will stop killing and stop inducing the suffering of Syrians. So I think the regime's propaganda tries to put it absolutely upside down.
So if you click on the next image, if you just click on the right there, in the very next image after that video, in that tweet, you'll see what his own colleague said. So we just heard Joel Rayburn of the Trump administration say that the claim that the sanctions hurt the Syrian people is a propaganda campaign by the Syrian government. But this is Joel Rayburn's own colleague, Andrew Tabler, writing in Foreign Affairs. He says that U.S. sanctions have, quote, led to corresponding cuts in regime subsidies that have exacerbated fuel and food shortages for everyday Syrians. So basically, Joel Rayburn is accusing his own colleague of taking part in a Syrian government propaganda campaign, if he actually believes what he says, which is that the claim that the sanctions hurt the Syrian people is just Syrian government propaganda. That's his own colleague from the Trump administration acknowledging that, what he dismisses as propaganda. So anyway, it's just so cynical. You impose these sanctions, you hurt everyday Syrians, the damage is done, the state collapses, the government's overthrown, and then everything is lifted back to normal. And then if you're an average Syrian, and your choice is like continuing to suffer under these sanctions because of who your government is, like something you have no control over, of course you're going to welcome anything that's going to bring you relief. Of course you're going to want to, you'd rather not live under sanctions than live under sanctions than most people, because these sanctions mean starvation and suffering. But for those who are imposing the sanctions, it's just cynical, because it's basically saying that you're going to suffer until you have the government that we want.
There's another little lie that he told. You correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he said the U.S. has upped its humanitarian assistance to Syria. It's not Syria, the country, it's Idlib. All the U.S. aid earmarked for Syria during that time was going to Al-Qaeda occupied Idlib, if I'm not mistaken. That I just picked that up when he said that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. And because people wanting to work to conduct humanitarian operations inside government-controlled Syria, back when it was controlled by the Assad government, they had to get all these exemptions and waivers. It was very, very hard to get, and a lot of groups didn't get it.
And U.S. occupied northeastern Syria probably as well was recipient to some.
Yeah, of course.
And Al-Tanf,
Yeah.
Probably.
Well,
ISIS families, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's where they retrained the moderate rebels and reintegrated them into the whatever has poured forth onto Syria.